Everyone remembers the headlines. Record-breaking ratings. Historic growth. A turning point moment for women's basketball that was supposed to prove the sport had finally crossed into a new era. Every press release sounded the same. Every highlight clip was framed like confirmation. The story was clean, optimistic, and easy to repeat. Women's basketball had arrived, and the numbers proved it. But here's the uncomfortable part that almost nobody wanted to sit with. Numbers don't just tell stories. They frame them. And when the framing changes, the story can look very different without anyone technically lying. During the peak of the WNBA season, fans were told over and over again that viewership was exploding. Social media amplified it. Media panels celebrated it. Sponsors leaned into it. The assumption became automatic. If the ratings are up, interest must be up. If interest is up, the foundation must be solid. End of discussion. Except that wasn't the full picture. Behind the scenes, the way viewership was being counted quietly shifted. Nielsen, the same company that decides what success looks like on paper, updated how audiences were measured. Streaming devices, delayed viewing, group settings, and broader data inputs suddenly mattered more than ever. Across television, this made numbers look healthier, bigger, more impressive. And that's where things get tricky. Because when everything starts looking bigger at the same time, it becomes harder to tell what's actually growing and what's just being measured differently. A change in methodology can create the appearance of momentum without guaranteeing that real demand exists underneath it. That distinction matters more than people realize. A sport can survive hype. It can survive a bad season. What it can't survive is building long-term expectations on numbers that haven't been stress-tested. The real test doesn't come during a media frenzy or a cultural moment. It comes later, when the spotlight dims and fans have to choose to show up again without being reminded every 5 minutes that history is happening. That's where the story starts to get uncomfortable. Because once the noise died down and the headlines moved on, something strange happened. The numbers didn't just cool off. They behaved differently. Quietly. Subtly at first. And then all at once. This isn't about hating women's basketball. It isn't about denying talent, effort, or skill. The athletes are elite. The games are real. The competition is legitimate. That part was never in question. The real question is simpler, and much harder to answer honestly. When a league has to redefine how progress is measured in order to prove it's succeeding, what exactly is it trying to stop people from noticing? That question sits at the center of everything that followed. This is where Unrivaled entered the conversation. It wasn't framed as just another league. It was positioned as evidence. Proof that women's basketball had finally reached a point where it could stand on its own terms. Modern, innovative, investor-friendly, and most importantly, sustainable. That word showed up everywhere. In interviews. In promotional language. In commentary from people who wanted this experiment to succeed. And on paper, the concept made sense. High-level talent. Clean presentation. Strategic partnerships. A schedule designed to avoid direct competition. Everything about it felt deliberate, engineered to avoid the pitfalls that had plagued past attempts. This wasn't supposed to be a risky gamble. It was supposed to be the future model. The logic was simple. If women's basketball interest was truly growing, a new league shouldn't have to fight for attention. Fans would show up naturally. Investors would feel confident. Networks would have leverage. The sport would finally have something it's been chasing for decades: stability. That's why Unrivaled mattered. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a stress test. A way to see whether the audience people kept talking about actually existed outside of peak hype cycles. If viewers followed the sport rather than just the moment, this league should have benefited. And for a brief window, it looked like it might. Season 1 arrived with curiosity on its side. People tuned in to see what this new thing was about. Social media helped. The novelty helped. The promise of something different helped. Early numbers were strong enough to fuel optimism, and optimism filled in the gaps that data couldn't yet answer. But optimism is fragile. Because sustainability isn't proven by how loudly something launches. It's proven by how quietly it survives. It's tested when the spotlight isn't doing the work for you. When fans have to remember you exist without being reminded constantly. That's where the pressure started building. Unrivaled didn't just need decent ratings. It needed consistency. It needed repeat viewers. It needed proof that curiosity could turn into routine. Without that, all the language about sustainability was just branding. And branding only holds until the numbers stop cooperating. The league had one job going into its next phase: show that the audience wasn't borrowed. That's when everything changed. At first, the celebration made sense. Women's basketball had more visibility than ever. Highlights were circulating. Debates were louder. Social media engagement looked healthy. When the ratings numbers came out, they seemed to confirm everything people wanted to believe. Growth wasn't just happening, it was accelerating. But something about those numbers felt off. Not wrong, not fake, just convenient. Across sports media, the same pattern kept showing up. Viewership was up, but the explanations behind why were getting softer. Definitions expanded. New qualifiers appeared. Phrases like total reach, combined platforms, and extended audience became common talking points. None of these are inherently dishonest, but they blur an important line between interest and availability. Because there's a difference between someone actively choosing to watch a game and someone being counted because a screen happened to be on in the same room. That distinction rarely makes headlines. When ratings rise because the way they're measured changes, success becomes harder to verify. It creates a feedback loop where good news reinforces belief, belief drives more coverage, and more coverage discourages skepticism. Questioning the numbers suddenly sounds like negativity, even when the questions are reasonable. And for a while, that worked. The conversation stayed focused on growth. Anyone pointing out potential cracks was labeled cynical or dismissive. The idea that momentum could stall wasn't popular, so it wasn't explored. Instead, the narrative hardened. Women's basketball wasn't just growing, it was unstoppable. But narratives only stay intact when reality cooperates. What made this moment different wasn't a single bad broadcast or one disappointing game. It was the realization that inflated metrics don't guarantee repeat behavior. Fans who show up once because something feels culturally important don't always come back when the novelty fades. That's when the numbers stop being abstract. Because real growth shows itself when attention persists without constant reinforcement. When viewers return even after the headlines move on. When curiosity turns into habit. And that's where the first warning signs started appearing. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make anyone paying close attention pause. Because if the audience was truly expanding, the follow-up should have been stronger, not weaker. And if the foundation was as solid as advertised, the next phase shouldn't have required new definitions to explain why fewer people were watching. That pause didn't last long. Because shortly after, a new league was positioned as the ultimate proof that everything being said was true. Season 2 was supposed to be confirmation. The curiosity phase was over. The concept was familiar. The talent was established. This was the moment where a sustainable league proves it doesn't need novelty to survive. If the foundation was real, the numbers wouldn't just hold, they'd stabilize. Instead, they dropped. Not gradually. Not subtly. They fell hard enough to erase the confidence built during the first season. Opening night, which should have been a reset moment, looked more like a warning sign. Viewership didn't just come in below expectations. It came in dramatically lower. The decline wasn't a rounding error. It wasn't a technical blip. It was nearly a 70% drop compared to where things had been. That kind of fall doesn't happen because of one bad matchup or an unlucky time slot. It happens when people choose not to return. Prime-time windows underperformed. Afternoon games struggled even more. Numbers that once hinted at momentum now whispered disinterest. For a league that had leaned heavily on the idea of inevitability, this was a reality check. Because momentum doesn't disappear unless it was borrowed. If Season 1 was driven by curiosity, Season 2 revealed how shallow that curiosity might have been. Viewers who showed up once didn't build the habit. They didn't circle the return date. Some didn't even know the season had started again. That's the most damaging part. A league can survive low ratings if awareness is high. It can survive awareness gaps if demand is strong. What it can't survive is both disappearing at the same time. And that's exactly what the numbers suggested. There was no sense of urgency around the broadcasts. No widespread conversation pulling casual fans back in. No must-watch energy. Without that, even great basketball struggles to hold attention. What made this collapse more unsettling was how fast it happened. In less than a year, Unrivaled went from being cited as a success story to becoming a cautionary example. The promise of sustainability didn't just weaken, it cracked under pressure. And the league hadn't even faced its biggest obstacle yet. Because Season 2 didn't just test audience loyalty. It tested whether modern measurement systems could rescue a failing narrative. They couldn't. This was supposed to be the safety net. Modern sports don't live or die by traditional TV anymore. That's the argument everyone leans on when numbers look shaky. Streaming counts. Smart TVs count. Delayed viewing counts. Group settings count. The industry has spent years building systems designed to protect leagues from looking smaller than they really are. In theory, this should have helped. Across sports, updated measurement models routinely soften bad news. Events that once looked underwhelming suddenly appear respectable. Marginal growth gets reframed as momentum. Declines get blurred into platform shifts. It's the closest thing the industry has to a built-in cushion. And yet, even with all of that working in its favor, Unrivaled's numbers barely moved. That's the part that doesn't get emphasized enough. When every other sport benefits from expanded counting and your league still struggles to clear modest benchmarks, the issue isn't methodology. It's demand. Big data can widen the lens, but it can't invent viewers who aren't there. This is where the sustainability narrative starts to unravel. Because the league wasn't being judged by old-school standards anymore. It was being measured by the most generous systems available. And even then, the audience didn't show up in meaningful numbers. Prime-time windows shrank. Afternoon games faded into statistical noise. The supposed backbone of the fanbase wasn't activating. What that reveals is uncomfortable. If a league can't hold attention after benefiting from inflated metrics, then the growth story was always fragile. It relied on timing, novelty, and narrative momentum more than actual viewer commitment. That's not a failure of technology. It's a failure of conversion. Interest didn't turn into habit. Awareness didn't turn into loyalty. Curiosity didn't turn into routine viewing. Without those transitions, no measurement system can carry you very far. And once that reality sets in, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the audience didn't disappear because of data issues, where did it go? The answer points to a problem nobody likes admitting out loud. This is the part where the conversation usually gets uncomfortable, because it shifts responsibility. Season 1 didn't succeed in a vacuum. It was carried by noise. Social media chatter. Media coverage. Endless reminders that something new was happening and that people were supposed to care. Even casual fans couldn't avoid hearing about it. Curiosity was constantly being refreshed. Season 2 didn't have that luxury. The return arrived quietly. Too quietly. There was no urgency. No sustained push. No sense that missing a game meant missing a moment. For a large portion of the audience, the league didn't just underperform, it was invisible. Some fans didn't tune out. They never tuned in to begin with. That distinction matters. People often confuse disinterest with ignorance, but they're not the same thing. Disinterest means someone chose not to watch. Ignorance means they didn't know there was anything to watch at all. Season 2 suffered from both, but the second problem may have been more damaging. Because awareness is the bare minimum requirement. You can have elite athletes. You can have competitive games. You can have clean production. None of it matters if fans aren't reminded that the product exists. Sports don't live on talent alone. They live on ritual, time slots, habit, expectation. When those disappear, even strong content struggles. Promotion isn't optional for a young league. It's oxygen. Season 1 benefited from novelty and momentum doing that work automatically. Season 2 required intentional effort, and that effort wasn't there at the same level. Without constant reinforcement, casual viewers drifted. Fringe fans forgot. And once momentum stalls, restarting it becomes exponentially harder. This is where sustainability becomes more than a buzzword. A sustainable league doesn't rely on constant hype spikes. It builds slow, repeatable behavior. People know when games are on. They expect them. They plan around them. That kind of engagement doesn't appear magically. It's built through repetition and visibility. When that process breaks down, the consequences show up quickly. And that breakdown doesn't just affect one league. Because when a high-profile experiment struggles to maintain awareness, it sends a signal far beyond its own broadcasts. It raises questions about the broader ecosystem, especially for the league everyone keeps comparing it to. That's where the implications get much bigger. This is where the ripple effects start to matter. Unrivaled doesn't exist in isolation. It lives in the shadow of the WNBA, drawing from the same talent pool, the same audience assumptions, and the same media narratives about growth. That connection is impossible to ignore, especially from the perspective that matters most: television. Networks don't just buy games. They buy expectations. When a spin-off or adjacent league struggles to hold viewers, it quietly reshapes how executives evaluate the entire ecosystem. Not because the products are identical, but because they test the same assumption: that there is a deep, reliable audience waiting to be activated outside of peak moments. That assumption is now under pressure. Media partners look at numbers differently than fans do. They don't care about online debates or viral clips in isolation. They care about consistency, repeatability, predictable audiences that show up regardless of storyline. When a league marketed as sustainable can't maintain viewership into its second season, it complicates future negotiations for everyone nearby. Because ratings are leverage. They shape ad rates. They influence broadcast windows. They determine whether a product gets promoted aggressively or quietly tucked into less visible slots. Declining numbers don't just reflect interest, they reduce negotiating power. And once that power weakens, it's incredibly hard to regain. For the WNBA, this matters as it cycles back into television conversations. Peak season attention can't carry the entire calendar. Networks want proof that interest exists beyond marquee names, beyond rivalry weeks, beyond cultural moments. They want evidence that audiences return when the novelty fades. Unrivaled was supposed to help make that case. Instead, it introduced doubt. That doesn't mean the WNBA is collapsing. It means expectations may need recalibration. Growth stories built on inflated momentum get scrutinized more closely when adjacent experiments falter. Executives start asking tougher questions. Projections get trimmed. Risk tolerance shrinks. And once skepticism enters the room, optimism alone isn't enough to push it back out. That's why this moment feels heavier than one set of ratings. Because what's being evaluated isn't just performance. It's belief. And belief is what keeps investors, networks, and partners aligned. Which brings us to the group paying the closest attention of all: the people whose money makes everything possible. This is the point where optimism stops being persuasive. Investors don't need perfection. They don't even need immediate profit. What they need is direction. A sense that the numbers are moving the right way, or at least holding steady long enough for a long-term plan to work. Losses can be justified. Volatility can be explained. But sustained decline is a different conversation. Because decline removes leverage. A league positioned as sustainable isn't evaluated the same way as a passion project. It's evaluated like a business. Audience size informs sponsorship value. Sponsorship value informs media leverage. Media leverage informs survival. When one piece weakens, the rest start to wobble. That's what makes this moment uncomfortable for anyone financially tied to the league. Season 1 allowed investors to believe the curve was pointing up. Season 2 suggested that curve might have been flatter than advertised. A drop of this size forces recalculations. Forecasts change. Timelines stretch. Assumptions get questioned. The phrase long-term growth suddenly needs footnotes. And those footnotes matter. Because investor confidence isn't loud when it fades. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in smaller ways. More cautious language. Fewer public commitments. Less aggressive expansion. A wait-and-see posture that quietly replaces enthusiasm. That shift changes everything. When confidence cools, spending tightens. Marketing budgets shrink. Promotion becomes conservative instead of ambitious. And without promotion, awareness drops further. It's a cycle that feeds on itself, especially for leagues that haven't yet built entrenched habits among fans. This is why sustainability can't be declared early. Real sustainability survives boredom. It survives low news weeks. It survives seasons where nothing dramatic happens. It survives because people show up anyway. When that behavior isn't established, every downturn feels existential. The concern here isn't that Unrivaled has bad basketball. It doesn't. The concern is that the business signals are flashing caution. Not panic. Not collapse. Just enough warning to force everyone involved to slow down. And once momentum slows in sports entertainment, restarting it costs more than most people expect. Which leads to the most difficult realization of all. The problem isn't talent. It never was. The problem is attention. This is where everything comes together. The story of Unrivaled isn't a story about failure. It's a story about exposure. It exposed the difference between interest and commitment, between curiosity and habit, between a moment that feels historic and a foundation that can actually support long-term growth. Talent was never the issue. The athletes delivered. The competition was real. The product on the floor wasn't empty. What turned out to be fragile was the assumption that attention automatically renews itself. Because attention doesn't work that way. It has to be earned repeatedly. It has to be reminded. It has to be given reasons to return even when nothing special is happening. When a league depends on peaks instead of routines, every drop feels dramatic. Not because the drop is shocking, but because there's nothing underneath to catch it. That's the warning hidden in these numbers. Sustainability isn't something you announce. It's something you demonstrate quietly, over time, when fewer people are watching closely. It shows up when viewership doesn't collapse the moment novelty fades. When promotion doesn't have to do all the work. When fans show up because they expect to, not because they're told they should. Unrivaled may survive. It may adjust. It may regroup and find a way forward. None of that is impossible. But what Season 2 made clear is that the growth narrative surrounding women's basketball is far more delicate than it's often presented. And that matters. Because narratives shape decisions. Decisions shape money. And money determines which leagues get patience and which ones get pressure. When the numbers stop cooperating, optimism alone doesn't carry much weight. The biggest mistake people make in moments like this is treating criticism as hostility. It isn't. It's a reality check. If the goal is long-term success, uncomfortable data matters more than comfortable stories. And that's why this conversation isn't going away. If you found this breakdown useful and you want more honest, data-driven analysis like this, not hype, not narratives, just what the numbers actually tell us, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think, especially when a channel is still growing. Like the video if you want this type of deep dive to keep coming. And leave a comment with your take on where you think women's basketball goes from here. Engagement tells the algorithm this conversation matters, and it helps this channel reach people who want real discussion, not recycled talking points. The numbers spoke this season. The only question now is who's actually listening.